So it's farewell to the 60s. Perhaps not the best decade in history, but certainly not the worst either.
The world was approaching the 1970s after arguably seeing more cultural change over a 10-year period than they had ever seen in their lifetimes. The 60s were a decade full of ambivalence, marked by resentment and turmoil, yet complemented by incredible revolutions in art, civil rights, and technological feats. It was these circumstances that gave many people a little bit of hope to still hold on to. Maybe all this anguish and fighting would turn out to actually mean something, and the 70s would become the decade that the 60s wanted to be. But unfortunately, in many respects, this would not end up being the case. I would even be bold enough to argue that the 70s were, overall, a fairly culturally stagnant period in recent history. Now, this isn't to say that nothing remarkable happened during this decade. In fact, a ton of things did, and we'll get more into that later. But it seemed to have happened under the veil of this more diluted version of 60s counterculture, a version that was a bit more industrial and technologically emphasized, and with a bit of a cynical, gloomy, almost creepy kind of feel to it. The 70s were kind of creepy. You see a huge rise in crime, pollution, media panic surrounding serial killers and abductions. Even horror movies are particularly much darker and more disturbing than arguably in other decades, before and after. Now, it's easy to cherry pick anything from any given period to make this claim, but this is the tone I have always felt when looking at most 70s media. Something just feels off about it. Everything looks so dull, almost dirty, and a bit ugly. But of course, it wasn't all bad. You had things like disco, shag carpet, lava lamps, bell bottoms, funk and soul music, long hair and shaggy beards, pet rocks, just to name a few things. You had people saying things like, "Far out! You're rad, man. Groovy." That's more 60s, but we'll get into that. And of course, my personal favorite, Harvest Gold and Avocado Green. All these things, both good and bad, are what helped give the 1970s that very distinct, almost disorienting and dreamlike appearance. But why? Why did the 1970s look like this specifically? What was it about this point in history that made all these things pop up at this specific time in such a disorderly way? Now, just like with all the decade videos I've done in the past, a lot of what I'll be covering is subjective and not a universal experience for everybody. There's always going to be exceptions to the things that I bring up. I'm instead going to be talking about the overall experiences of people in the 70s as a collective. And of course, I will mostly be talking about the 70s in the Western world. And given this is 10 years worth of history, I'm not going to get to every single major event, but I will try my best. With that said, live from New York, it's Saturday night. I'm actually in Los Angeles, and it's a Wednesday. So, now the decade already had a pretty tumultuous start. Within its first few months, you had the aftermath of the Altamont Free concert tragedy, the Manson family scare out in California, the Kent State shooting, and to a lesser but still culturally significant extent, the breakup of the Beatles. Many historians often cite these events, individually or collectively, as the events which officially started the 1970s. They were at least crucial moments in which the tone and attitude of things were starting to change, and in many ways, not really for the better. That sort of hazy optimism of the 1960s counterculture hippie era was starting to die down a bit and show its true colors. Quite literally. It's at the beginning of the 70s where you see a huge rise in popularity among a very distinct color palette that was marketed as Harvest Gold and Avocado Green. These were colors which both contained adjectives associated with nature and the earth, as the late 60s saw a huge rise in environmentalism and attentiveness for taking care of the planet. As a result, you start to see this show up everywhere, even on walls, carpets, furniture, and kitchen appliances. Now, who would want to decorate their room to look like that? Now, it may not seem like it at face value, but these strange and, dare I say, gaudy design choices and the hardships people were experiencing at the start of the 70s are in fact related to each other. A big aspect of 1960s counterculture was this pushback against pollution, excessive industrialism, and consumerism, which in turn emphasized a better relationship with the earth and nature, literally returning to our roots as a species and as a planet. In fact, the very first Earth Day was in 1970. A big component of this movement could be traced back to Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, back in 1962. But we'll get more into detail on that when we discuss the 60s, which is by far my favorite decade to study from the 20th century. While these environmental sentiments predominantly existed in the 60s, and keep in mind the majority of people at the time were not hippies, the aesthetics and vibes of this hippie style were very much present. And in a sort of backwards way, you could make the argument that this was just one of many indicators that the ambitions of 1960s counterculture ultimately failed. This whole philosophy and belief system that rejected materialism was now being bought and sold. It's one of the main reasons why Andy Warhol was so controversial. He effectively made capitalism itself into a work of art. And so this bohemian counterculture style continued, but in a more diluted, tech-infused form, all while pollution persisted. This is when you start to see things like bell-bottoms really become a thing, as well as things like peace sign belts, platform shoes, long unkempt hair on men, all accompanied with strange, often reflective patterns and bright neon colors. Not to mention that polyester becomes huge at this time, because it was cheap, easy to maintain, and allowed for these colors to really pop. Now, if you think this look feels very disorienting, almost fever dream-esque, well, that was the point. They were the visual representations of the psychedelic, trippy style of the 60s and its connotation with drugs. You know, the kind of weird shapes and colors a person would see while on a trip. It can be easy to forget just how influential the 60s were in forming the traits that we associate with the 70s today. But once you really pay close attention, they are distractingly similar. Other ways that this psychedelic, vibrant style was packaged and sold was through very abstract, trippy products that served more as a novelty over anything else. You start to see lava lamps become popular at this time. When a regular lamp will do, this serves no other purpose than to just be eccentric and show something cool and surreal in your house. Again, who would want something like that? There's also the beanbag chair. It was another household appliance that could be used like any other, while still exhibiting a very abstract, nonsensical appearance. These were once again trends that spilled over from the 60s and essentially took on a more aesthetically mainstream and less politically niche form. Like we mentioned earlier, what really makes 70s culture stand out from the 60s was that much of this 60s style was repurposed, with a more technological emphasis and even just a desire to do something new for the sake of it. With the success of the Apollo 11 moon landing, it in many ways felt like the sky was the limit technologically, and they wanted to bring that into everyday life as well. It's also at this same time where the microprocessor is starting to get smaller and smaller thanks to something called Moore's Law. This not only made these intimidating IBM-style mainframes commonly seen in office buildings much tinier, but also much more affordable and even user-friendly. This opened the door for something called the personal computer, with the Commodore PET, TRS-80, and Apple II all releasing in 1977, the year of the computer boom. The advanced capability of these machines allowed for people to further quench this thirst for adventure and a unique experience. You then had more eccentric inventions like the waterbed, described as an innovative new sleeping experience, while also being marketed as a symbol of sexual liberation and rebellion, which were big components of 60s counterculture. You also had the continuation of things like the conversation pit a more interactive and exciting way to entertain house guests. However, these would start to decline in popularity once television sets became the focal point of living room setups. You then had strange trends like the pet rock, which were sort of combination of this connection with the earth and nature and this desire to have a new yet unique and absurd experience. But this idea of trying to create a whole new experience for people was also extending into art, and this growing technological capability fueled it. Television is a great example of this, with televised mass media continuing to rapidly grow since the 1950s, and with color TVs becoming more commonplace, there was a bit more room to use television as an outlet to be more creative and even thematically sophisticated. Shows like MASH were able to resonate with an entire generation of war veterans with relatable entertainment while also covering very serious subject matters. But of course, you still had those typical all-American shows like The Brady Bunch and The Partridge Family, which showed these squeaky clean, idealized versions of family life to give viewers an escape from real life.
Marcia? Marcia, is that you?
Oh my no!
Yep, that's your side of the family.
It's also at this time where television continues to serve as a shared experience. Live variety shows like Saturday Night Live would really challenge comedy as an art form, incorporating elements of much more deadpan, sarcastic humor. And given the political climate of the time, people loved it. And much like the people who watched the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969 with pure wonder, over 40 million people watched Apollo 13's peril with great anxiety. But television also served as a great outlet for civil rights. Shows like Different Strokes, Sanford and Son, The Jeffersons, and even the Jackson 5 cartoon brought diversity and black representation to the living room, challenging stereotypes and making the conversation surrounding civil rights much more tangible and even immersive. Things were by no means resolved, but it showed just how much things advanced compared to 10 years before. And this most certainly applied to music as well. Funk entered the spotlight as a derivation of 60s soul and R&B music. This, of course, included elements of Motown, but it was largely influenced by the incredible work and innovations of James Brown. Some popular musical acts within the broader funk, soul, and R&B landscape include Earth, Wind & Fire, Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, the Bee Gees, Funkadelic, and the Jacksons. You even see this genre of music start to compete with shows like American Bandstand through a new show called Soul Train. It was once again a way to turn music into a new experience. The popularization of concept albums in the 1960s reinforced this as well. Technological breakthroughs like 16-track recording and Wendy Carlos's innovative work with computerized synthesizers in 1971 showed that the landscape was about to get so much more sophisticated. In 1973, Pink Floyd releases The Dark Side of the Moon. Not only does this album feature these technological innovations we just mentioned, but its very presentation and packaging were innovative as well. In addition to featuring very abstract cover art, essentially expanding on the methods of the Beatles and the Velvet Underground, it also covered themes directly related to the human condition in quite a candid way. It even focused on the less ideal, more uncomfortable aspects of humanity, like greed, materialism, and insanity, with the album's lyrics and musical composition personifying them. A big part of Dark Side of the Moon's ongoing mainstream popularity is the way it covers these themes. It resonates with a lot of people, and it especially did for its contemporary listeners. Rock music, in general, kind of takes a more real turn during this period. Its sound is much rougher, and overall energy is much more jaded. Of course, there are exceptions to this, and we'll get into that too, but I really want to talk about why the 70s were this way. Again, the 70s were dark in ways that we probably will never see again. So dark, in fact, that some of the things that I want to talk about, I can't without YouTube demonetizing or even taking down this video. Especially when comparing it to the much more sanitized media of the 50s and 60s, all this grittiness, gloominess, even violence is omnipresent. where does it come from?
Well, we could certainly learn a thing or two about a thing or two. My viewers always ask me, Cameron, you're the Casanova of San Francisco. How do I get a girl? Well, just tell her how groovy she is. Chicks dig that, man. You know what they also dig? Is glasses. Warby Parker glasses, to be specific. Here I have the Chemi-Wide and Licorice Crystal with the anti-reflective and scratch-resistant coating, so that I can not only get a good glimpse at those who worship me, but now I can also see all the success and potential that the universe has laid out for me. And thanks to Warby Parker's love for their customers, you can go into any Warby Parker store and get your glasses personally stylized with the help of friendly advisors, just like I did. With Warby Parker, I just feel whole again, man. The ladies just can't get enough of it. I don't know if it's them reminiscing of their adolescence, rocking out to Buddy Holly, but it's freaking transcendental, man. You can get your own Warby Parker glasses today by visiting the QR code on the screen or the link down below. Pairs start at $95 plus free shipping and free 30-day returns, and even gives you the option to use vision insurance. And every purchase you make gives someone in need their own pair of eyeglasses through Warby Parker's Buy a Pair, Give a Pair program. Now that's out of sight if you ask me. See what I did there? Stay cool, Warby Parker.
Like most complex things, it doesn't have just one singular cause. And what's even more interesting, historians still don't fully know why the 70s were like this. But there are theories, which we'll get into. One thing that we do know, however, is that the 70s started off with a less than ideal economic situation. The end of the 60s saw a lot of government spending on things like the Vietnam War and Great Society social programs. Now, is government spending an inherently bad thing? No, of course not. It was primarily the way it was handled and the way economic policy was viewed and structured at the time. The government spending that occurred throughout the 60s led to federal budget deficits and more immediate cash entering circulation, which, in the short term, increased aggregate demand a bit too much. Now, this is going to get a bit technical, but I'll keep it as short and simple as I can. In other words, when the government is spending more than it makes and is pushing the economy beyond what it can realistically produce, demand gets larger than supply. This causes prices to go up, and that's how you get inflation. Okay, inflation. Big deal. It's not like people in the 70s hadn't seen that before. Well, this is when things really get weird. In 1971, the US officially dissolved the Bretton Woods system, semantically known as the gold standard. This meant that every dollar printed no longer had to be backed by gold, but instead the US government itself could choose how much money they wanted to print. This is known as fiat currency, as it is no longer backed by a limited commodity like gold, but instead backed by the world's confidence in the US's strong economy. This was known as the Nixon shock, and this gave the US government more freedom to print more and spend more money, which contributed to the economy overheating. Additionally, economists at the time were following a model known as Keynesian economics, which believes that the government itself can control demand by increasing spending during bad times and doing the opposite during good times. They also believed in something called the Phillips curve, which suggested that low unemployment correlated with higher inflation and vice versa. This was a key model used in Keynesian economics. Due to the political climate of the 1960s, the government's big priority was to keep unemployment low. So they kept these interest rates low, especially since they assumed this inflation would be temporary, because it usually was. However, what economists failed to consider at the time was the long-term effects of inflation. The longer inflation continues to grow, the more expensive things get, the more people struggle to support themselves. They start demanding higher pay from their employers to combat this, even unionizing in many cases. The operating costs of the business now go up because they now have to pay their employees more. Because things are more expensive, the businesses have to raise their prices to cover these new costs, so economic growth slows down. The government eventually sees this and decides to finally raise interest rates, but not high enough to combat this inflation. Instead, it just ended up making borrowing more expensive for businesses. To save money, these businesses then start laying off employees. These issues become cyclical and start to make things exponentially worse, like a sort of snowball effect. After enough time, you now have inflation and unemployment occurring at the same time. Stagflation.
Productivity is declining because people don't want to work anymore, want everything for nothing.
Paul works a 6-day week. With his wages plus his wife's earnings as a secretary, the two of them were able to save enough money to buy a small house, something that's impossible for most young couples to do these days.
Despite this being a unique, kind of scary situation, economists thought that with enough time, it would get under control. Again, this would just be temporary. But then something unprecedented happens. Supply shock, particularly the oil embargo of 1973. Geopolitical conflict with the Middle East led to oil supply being drastically cut for the US. Not only did this make oil prices quadruple, it made energy way more expensive and led to a gas shortage. This meant that less cars and trucks were on the road, which meant that transporting goods and commodities was more difficult. Even people commuting to their jobs was now more difficult. This meant there was now less overall productivity in society, and so supply went down, which made stagflation even worse than it already was. So much worse. Inflation eventually entered the double digits, reaching 12% in 1974 and peaking at 15% in 1980. By 1975, unemployment peaked at 9%. Because oil is inelastic, the price of it stayed high even after the embargo ended, and this was only exacerbated by the Iranian Revolution in 1979. US state governments then started rationing gas, typically based on license plate numbers. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could get gas on the odd days of the calendar month, and vice versa. Combine this with both environmental and domestic political issues. Although the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970 and did make a difference, red tape, loopholes, and just slow adaptation didn't fix the pollution problem overnight. It also didn't immediately solve the long-term effects of lead poisoning from gasoline emissions in the atmosphere. This was an issue that persisted even decades after unleaded gasoline was introduced in the mid-70s. Symptoms of prolonged lead exposure include delirium, increased irritability, and developmental delays. More irritable people are more likely to be violent, and pollution can decrease quality of life. This can then lead to crime. You probably see where this is going. Combine this with more affluent households moving out of the cities and into the suburbs, PTSD from Vietnam War veterans, baby boomers coming of age at this time after being raised by adults who often had PTSD from World War II, and desensitization from violence in mass media, you get what is essentially a horror show. These circumstances really affected large metropolitan areas like New York City, which saw record high crime rates in the 70s. New York City was so dangerous at this time, it's literally what the movie Taxi Driver is about. Other films like Network are contemporary commentaries about how ugly and dangerous the world is depicted in mass media, because that drives more ratings.
Stick your head out of the window, open it, and stick your head out and keep yelling and yell, I'm as mad as hell, I'm not gonna take this anymore. I'm mad as hell!
This is also a very popular theory for why there were so many serial killers in the 70s. These factors mixed in with the rising popularity of hitchhiking, which made it easier to commit an unreported crime, and the sensationalism and exposure from mass media to inspire copycats. It's also why horror movies from the 70s are so damn terrifying. In addition to the Hays Code ending in 1968 and films switching to the MPAA rating system, people were just so jaded to violence. It gave them more leeway to really push the envelope. It's also important to note that although the Hays Code ended, this was still during a time before cable, so the FCC was still heavily regulating network television. This is a big reason why TV shows were still much more sanitized in comparison. And of course, you had political turmoil. You had the War on Drugs, an initiative which led to mass incarceration of drug users and predominantly affected minority groups. You then had the Watergate scandal, which surrounded a break-in that occurred at the DNC headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., a situation that implicated President Nixon.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
This led to great public outcry, impeachment proceedings, and eventually Nixon's resignation in 1974. When Gerald Ford took over as president, he then pardoned Nixon, which further created public disgust and distrust against the government. And by the time Jimmy Carter took over, this economic and geopolitical instability only worsened, and Carter's perceived ineffective leadership made a lot of the public blame him as well. You then had the assassination of Harvey Milk, the first openly gay elected official in California history. It was one of many catalysts to galvanize the gay rights movement, as well as its opposition towards the end of the decade. A conversation that started gaining momentum in 1969 with the Stonewall riots. And then at the very end of the decade, you had the Iranian hostage crisis. All these things significantly lowered quality of life for a lot of people in the 1970s. Many of these people who once saw the United States as the envy of the world in the 50s and 60s, frankly now saw the country as one giant embarrassment. And once again, this is something you can viscerally pick up on when looking at 70s film and photographs. The vibe is just often very pedestrian and resigned. But in a sort of backwards way, all these terrible things did still have a positive byproduct, and it would end up becoming one of the most memorable, yet parodied and embellished aspects of the 1970s. Disco. Borrowing from many of the bright, extravagant elements of counterculture, with, once again, a bit of a technological twist to it, disco served as a sense of escapism for a lot of people, predominantly working class, Black, and LGBT people. In fact, much of disco music is derived from funk, and compared to its 60s ancestors, has a much groovier, bass-heavy sound, thanks to advancing technology. Disco would really explode in popularity with the release of Saturday Night Fever in 1977 with John Travolta and its incredible Bee Gees soundtrack. This was a movie about a man who literally uses disco to find a purpose and to escape his otherwise difficult and mundane life. This escapism also manifested in more provocative, campy, and otherworldly genres, such as glam and punk rock, many of which often challenged gender norms and embraced sexual fluidity. Notable acts would include David Bowie, Queen, Elton John, Kiss, and the Sex Pistols. These bleak circumstances created another interesting byproduct: film. But not just film on its own, but the way it started to be watched. From the years 1965 to 1970, the number of malls in the United States went from 1,500 to 12,500. This gave people a lot of exciting things to do. One common mall activity was going to the movies, which were buildings that famously had air conditioning. This was especially pleasant during the summer, and it's at this time where all the kids are out of school, meaning more people who can spend their allowance to go to the movies. It was like the stars aligned for an upcoming director named Steven Spielberg to use brilliant, very widespread marketing to create what is considered the very first summer blockbuster movie.
It is as if God created the devil and gave him Jaws.
The release of Jaws would start a whole new cultural phenomenon of summer blockbusters, giving people 2 hours to escape their often difficult lives for a whole new world, or even a galaxy far, far away.
A cowboy movie set in space. That's Star Wars. It's old-fashioned, escapist entertainment, pure and simple, with no moral, no message.
And sadly, for a lot of people, this structure the 70s had made it seem like the efforts of 60s counterculture to make the world a better and more peaceful place all kind of happened in vain. What on earth happened over this past decade to create so much damn change? In 1971, a musician wrote a song lamenting over this exact concept, and it would spark the flame to a whole new genre of 70s culture. The musician's name was Don McLean, and the song was called American Pie, a single from the album of the same name. American Pie is my favorite song of all time, and the meaning behind its strange lyrics is technically a mystery to this day. Don McLean has always avoided giving full explanations in interviews, but the most popular and most likely interpretation is that the song is about the tragic plane crash that killed rock and roll singers Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, the Big Bopper, and their pilot Roger Peterson on February 3rd, 1959.
I'll be close and tell me how you feel.
These three were on tour when the crash occurred, and it is often culturally considered the end of the 1950s, the death of rock and roll innocence, and the birth of the Beach Boys, Beatlemania era of rock music. The song alludes to this longing for the past and how the world has lost its way, featuring lyrics such as, "Now for 10 years we've been on our own, and moss grows fat on a rolling stone, but that's not how it used to be." By the way, little fun fact, I was a huge fan of Don McLean as a kid, and he gave me a personal shout out on the radio when I was 11. Just wanted to share that with you. American Pie was a huge hit. Not only that, it started a whole new era of retrospective art, a nostalgia for the 1950s. 2 years later, you have the release of American Graffiti, which some historians also debate as being the first summer blockbuster, even before Jaws. The popularity of this movie would follow with Happy Days, which featured a very similar cast. This was also the show which popularized the term jumping the shark, as the Fonz literally jumps over a shark, and people just thought it was ridiculous. Then you had spin-off shows like Laverne and Shirley, other blockbusters like Grease, and even 50s-style contemporary rock music enters the mainstream. This was a whole other transcendental form of escape for people to go back to just how things were before. It was almost like a good number of people, almost on a subconscious level, were feeling that the 60s were a mistake. But all they could do now was ambivalently look back, drinking whiskey and rye, singing "This'll Be the Day That I Die." If you would like a follow-up video on the 1970s covering some of these topics in greater detail, please let me know in the comments. If you want to watch more of my decade videos, I have included a playlist down below. And if you'd like to learn more about the history of television and its run-ins with the FCC, you can watch that video right here. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. Check out patreon.com/nationsquid for more interactive and exclusive content, as well as ad-free access to my videos. Feel free to buy me a coffee as well, which is not affected by stagflation. Thank you for watching. I got a skitty for now.